Sohila, a young woman in Afghanistan, is walked into the Ghazi soccer stadium in Kabul on a Friday afternoon. As she kneels before the cheering crowd of thousands of men and Taliban soldiers, she prepares herself for the 100 lashes she is about to receive, the standard punishment for an unmarried woman who is seen walking in public with a man that is not her relative. If Sohila was married, she would be stoned to death for adultery by this excited crowd. It is unfortunate that this ritual had become a part of daily life in Afghanistan between 1996 and 2001, when Taliban controlled roughly two-thirds of the country. The extremist group placed in laws that banned many things such as music, internet, and female education, and failure to obey these laws resulted in horrific punishment, normally death. During these 5 years, Afghanistan was the most oppressive country to women in the world. The pictures here are a comparison of women's rights prior to Taliban control. Their style was similar to many other parts of the world, but under Taliban, women were expected to cover every piece of their body, including their eyes. They were not allowed to dress in any color of pattern fabrics. Living standards for citizens were low and virtually impossible to improve, as there wasn't even an accurate population count at this time. However, Afghanistan began to see a decline in their country's well-being long before Taliban control. In 1979, their GDP began a 21-year decline of 1.236 billion US dollars, according to the World Bank. This was explained by the beginning of a 35-year war within the country. The Soviet forces invaded Afghanistan and started what locals refer to as the Russian War in September 1979. For 10 years, the war raged on within the country and divided Afghans into groups. The Soviet forces backed Najibullah, who was elected president in 1987. The group of Afghans that opposed this was called the Mujahideen. This group was backed by the United States at the time and had a more radical Islamic view. After the Soviet forces pulled out of the country in 1989, a full-blown civil war had begun. The Mujahideen overthrew Najibullah in 1992. To make matters more complicated, members of the Mujahideen group began to fight each other at this point for control over the now ungoverned Kabul, one of the major cities in Afghanistan. After 4 more years of civil war, the Taliban rose from a small village called Mahal. After 5 years of control, the Taliban fell in late 2001 due to intervention of the United States of America. As part of an ongoing mission to eliminate the extremist group, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, otherwise referred to as NATO, and other allied forces have been in combat from 2003 up until this year. Last month, British forces officially left the war as part of NATO's exit strategy. The United States is the only remaining country left in Afghanistan and is planned to be fully out by 2016. It currently estimates that 42% of Afghanistan is below the poverty line, and an additional 20% are severely close to falling below that poverty line. The general living conditions for citizens are quite poor. Since the Taliban fell, there have been over 3 million refugees that returned home from Iran and Pakistan. These people generally live near the major cities such as Kabul and in order to find work. However, they are forced to live in mud houses and tents on the outskirts of the city. An additional 1.5 million people move from rural areas to the city every year for the same reason, but due to their lack of education, they struggle to find work. The slums surrounding these cities are growing at an alarming rate, only worsening these living conditions. Between 2002 and 2012, the population of Kabul alone grew from 500,000 to 5 million people. Afghanistan has 35 years of damage to fix and multiple countries ready to help. According to the World Bank, Afghanistan receives the most international aid in the world at 6.73 billion US dollars in 2012 to 2014 alone. To put this into perspective, Vietnam was the country with the second highest amount of international aid with a value of 4.12 billion US dollars. That is a difference of 2.61 billion. With this amount of money, one would think that the country would be seeing a much greater improvement, but the issues are not as straightforward as one would think. When NATO forces took control of the country's security services in 2003, in order to better the system, there was a phase-out plan developed that would slowly give control back to local Afghanistan authorities. This has given the country a more stable and reliable police force, but has also introduced wages that must be paid to these locals and is now the responsibility of the Afghan government. Without international aid money, the country would be unable to fund these security services. In regards to international development itself, there are many problems that arise when working in Afghanistan. There are 4 main water sources that run through the country: the Panjshir and Amudari, the Kabul, the Helmand, and the Hari Rud. All of these sources are shared with at least one other country, which all relies on them heavily for irrigation, domestic purposes, flood control, and hydropower. The Salma Dam, for example, on the Harry Rudd River, will be a 550-meter high dam that will produce 42 megawatts of electricity and irrigate 75,000 acres of land, which will mainly be used in Herat and surrounding rural areas. This will make great improvements to the local economy, as 85% of the country still relies on the agriculture as their main sources of income. Furthermore, people within Herat city itself are lucky if they have access to electricity for 4 hours a day. The constant demand for these water sources by all surrounding areas make it difficult to complete the dam. Construction began in 1976, but as the war began, the Indian company that was building it pulled out. In 2004, the Asian Bank revisited the idea, and in 2006, construction finally started back up. The Indian company that would build it estimated a cost of $200 million US, only a tiny fraction of the entire international aid money this country receives. In less than a year, Iran and the other countries that share the river stopped the project. Currently, there are limited treaties in place in order to improve the use of these sources to better suit the citizens' need. Having just come out of this long war, Afghanistan's population is generally very uneducated. The adult literacy rate is only 29%. Most females lack basic education from the Taliban era, and for many others, school was just not a top priority in such an unsafe time. This leads to the issue of the country being poorly represented in conferences that debate the uses of these rivers, as few people are skilled enough to make an adequate treaty. Once the Salma Dam is complete, it will cut off 70% of the water flow to Iran, which is why their government is working so heavily to stop this construction. Currently, 80% of the dam is complete, and it is expected to be completed within a year. Without treaties and clear boundaries, construction can legally continue. However, this has caused extremist groups from Iran to take drastic measures. In April of 2013, there was 1,300 kilograms of explosives confiscated that were designated to destroy this dam. However, this is not to say that all development projects are a lost cause in Afghanistan. A campaign called Too Young to Wed was started in 2002 in Herat, Afghanistan, by a visual journalist named Stephanie Sinclair. It began when she witnessed women setting themselves on fire. She wondered why were they so willingly doing this to themselves. After talking to the multiple victims in the burn ward, she noticed that they had all been child brides, some married as young as 7 or 8, and some of them were even so young that when they stood at the altar, they were still carrying their childhood toys. Women took these extreme measures in order to escape their husbands. Some were considered fortunate if they managed to move to a shelter, but that was a very rare case. For the next 12 years, Sinclair worked to raise awareness through photographic evidence of child brides. These pictures are just a few examples of some of the shocking images she has managed to obtain. The work has spread into 6 other countries, including Nepal and Ethiopia, and even shockingly, the United States. Last week, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a historic resolution to end child, early, and forced marriage. This long project has finally seen results. As a human race that understands compassion, it is safe to say that we hope Afghanistan finally finds peace. Through international development and streamlined use of aid money, the country can begin this journey through rebuilding itself. In the novel The Places in Between by author Rory Stewart walks the deserts of Afghanistan in 2002 from Herat to Kabul just after the Taliban fell. He stops every night in a new village where he interviews the locals. He shares their opinions on the war and truly displays the effect it has had on a country's culture. Most of the people he talks to have fought for or against either the Russians or the Taliban, and mostly both. For each village, it is roughly 25 kilometers apart, one day's walk, but yet each place has a different view on the war and seem to fight completely different sides. Their classes did not stem from wealth or knowledge, but was based heavily on involvement in combat and how many people they had killed. This mentality with little access to other cultures can be hard to break. As the author got further into the desert, the less the people valued their government. In war-stricken countries, this is something international development workers will have to deal with on an ongoing basis. Violence can divide a nation and destroy development projects within minutes. This is perhaps the greatest defining factor in a country's success. Money and aid can only truly be effective when the country is ready for it. And although Afghanistan has a very long way to come, it seems as though the post-war era may finally allow them to strive.